What happens when two adversaries with decades of hostility return to the negotiating table while aircraft carriers move into position? Iran and the United States are preparing for a second round of nuclear talks, even as Washington deploys a second carrier strike group to the region and signals readiness for sustained military action if diplomacy collapses. This video unpacks what is truly at stake in this renewed confrontation. If negotiations succeed, sanctions relief could reshape oil flows, regional alliances, and global energy markets. If they fail, the risk of military escalation increases in a region already strained by conflict. The outcome will influence not only Iran's nuclear trajectory, but also US credibility, Israeli security calculations, and China's energy supply chain. The dispute traces back decades but intensified in 2015 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under that agreement, Iran accepted limits on uranium enrichment and intrusive inspections in exchange for sanctions relief. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the accord and reimposed sweeping economic sanctions. Iran gradually reduced its compliance, increasing enrichment levels and stockpiles beyond earlier thresholds. Now both sides are testing whether a revised framework is possible. Iranian officials have indicated that durability requires tangible economic benefits for Washington as well as Tehran. A senior diplomat responsible for economic diplomacy suggested that joint interest in oil and gas fields, shared energy development, mining investments, and even aircraft purchases could form part of a broader arrangement. The implicit argument is that the earlier deal lacked direct US economic incentives, making it politically fragile. On the American side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the president prefers diplomacy and a negotiated settlement, while acknowledging that no prior US administration achieved a fully durable agreement with Tehran. At the same time, Reuters reported that US officials are preparing contingency plans for sustained military operations if talks collapse. The deployment of a second aircraft carrier underscores that deterrence accompanies diplomacy. Recent developments sharpen the stakes. A US delegation, including envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, is scheduled to meet Iranian officials in Geneva. The choice of venue reflects a familiar pattern of neutral European mediation. Iranian representatives have confirmed the meeting, signaling seriousness about engagement. Deputy Foreign Minister Majid Takht Ravanchi conveyed that Iran is prepared to compromise in exchange for sanctions relief. He indicated that the responsibility now lies with Washington to demonstrate commitment to a deal. Iran's atomic energy chief suggested earlier that Tehran could dilute its most highly enriched uranium if sanctions are lifted. However, Iranian officials have reiterated that zero enrichment inside the country remains unacceptable. For Washington, enrichment on Iranian soil presents proliferation risk. For Tehran, it represents sovereign technological capability. This disagreement over enrichment is not symbolic. Uranium enriched to higher purity levels shortens the breakout time required to produce weapons-grade material. Although Iran denies seeking nuclear weapons, Western governments view enrichment capacity as a potential pathway. Monitoring, caps, and verification mechanisms therefore become central technical components of any agreement. Complicating matters, the United States joined Israel in June in a series of airstrikes targeting Iranian nuclear sites. Those strikes signaled willingness to use force to prevent perceived escalation. Simultaneously, economic pressure continues. At a White House meeting, President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly agreed to work toward reducing Iran's oil exports to China. China currently purchases more than 80% of Iran's exported oil, making Beijing the primary revenue lifeline for Tehran under sanctions. Energy flows are critical. Iran's oil exports generate hard currency needed to stabilize its economy. Sanctions have constrained access to international banking and investment. If Washington successfully curtails sales to China, Iran's fiscal space narrows dramatically. Conversely, if sanctions ease, global oil supply could increase, influencing prices and regional trade balances. Consider the first scenario. What if Geneva talks yield a phased agreement in which Iran caps enrichment at lower levels, dilutes existing high-enriched stockpiles, and accepts enhanced inspections in return for partial sanctions relief? Oil exports could expand, easing pressure on global markets. US companies might explore limited commercial opportunities tied to aviation or energy services. Regional tensions could moderate, reducing immediate risk of confrontation. Now consider a second scenario. What if negotiations collapse over enrichment thresholds or sequencing of sanctions relief? With two US carrier groups in the region and Israel signaling intolerance for nuclear advancement, military strikes could resume or intensify. Iran has threatened retaliation against any US attack, potentially targeting regional bases or maritime routes. Escalation could disrupt shipping lanes in the Gulf, affecting global energy supply. A third possibility lies between these poles: prolonged, inconclusive talks. In that case, both sides maintain pressure while avoiding open conflict. Iran continues incremental nuclear advances within ambiguous boundaries. The United States tightens sanctions enforcement and diplomatic isolation. Markets remain volatile and regional actors hedge their positions. The geopolitical context extends beyond bilateral rivalry. For Israel, Iranian enrichment remains an existential concern. For Gulf states, stability in oil transit routes is paramount. For China, continued access to discounted Iranian crude supports energy security. For Europe, preventing another conflict near its periphery is a strategic priority. The internal politics of both countries also matter. In Washington, any agreement faces scrutiny from Congress and allied governments. In Tehran, leaders must balance economic relief against domestic expectations of sovereignty and resistance. The durability of a deal depends on whether both sides perceive tangible benefits that outlast electoral cycles. Technical details will determine credibility, verification mechanisms, inspection frequency, enrichment caps measured in percentage purity, and stockpile limits quantified in kilograms are not abstract figures. They define breakout timelines and compliance confidence. Sequencing of sanctions relief, whether immediate or phased, influences trust. Watch closely for language emerging from Geneva. If references to joint economic projects become more specific, that suggests a shift toward transactional incentives. Monitor oil export data, particularly shipments to China, as an indicator of enforcement intensity. Observe military deployments in the Gulf as signals of deterrence posture.